third, and arguably the best example, in my opinion, one of the best examples, is Augustine. And this is the example that the first two clips I brought up earlier from Trent Horn and from William Albrecht, this is the very one that they responded to. And you'll do yourself a favor by rewatching what they said, going to those clips, to their videos, seeing what they say about the text, and then read the text itself. Because there's a world of difference between what they say Augustine says and what Augustine actually says. So the first part, this is from Augustine's exposition on Psalm 115 in the Latin text, because I looked at the Latin text for this one as well. It's Sermon 2 of Psalm 113, so it's a little bit confusing, but otherwise in the English collections, in the Schaef collection, it's exposition on Psalm 115. This is section 6, and the next section is section 7, so they immediately follow. So Augustine says, "But they seem to themselves to have a purer religion, who say, I neither worship an idol nor a devil, but in bodily image I behold an emblem of that which I am bound to worship." Then skipping ahead a little bit because there is actually a little bit of a section between that. They presume to reply that they worship not the bodies themselves, but the deities which preside over the government of them. Notice this with each, with Augustine here and with Arnobius. And did Lactantius say the same? Well, Lactantius assumed that the pagans had a distinction between idols and gods. So with all of our examples here, there is actually a conscious acknowledgement by the fathers that the pagans did not believe that they were literally worshipping the idol itself, but the god who exists behind it. In other words, the the pagans, they actually accepted the iconodule logic of honor passing from the image to the prototype. And yet each of these fathers still has a problem with that. They still deny that principle here. That's the issue. So it's not, this is the key, actually the key reasoning why with a number of patristic examples, the iconodule argument of, oh, well, they're responding to pagan context, so it's not relevant to iconodulia. This is one of the key reasons why that doesn't work, because they're actually responding to pagan reasoning, which nonetheless recognizes a distinction between idol and God, and that the idol is simply a conduit by which worship is directed to the god, that they're not actually worshiping the idol itself. This is iconodulia. This is iconodulia, whether you like it or not. So yes, there is actually a very direct response here, something which is dangerously close to iconodulia, and thus, as we've seen with Arnobius and Lactantius already, their criticisms are things which grind against badly the iconodulic worldview. And now we're going to see the same with Augustine, even more bluntly, in my opinion. They presume to reply that they worship not the bodies themselves, but the deities which preside over the government of them. One sentence of the apostle, therefore, testifieth to their punishment and condemnation, who, he saith, have changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For in the former part of this sentence he condemned idols, in the latter the account they give of their idols. For by designating images wrought by an artificer by the names of the works of God's creation, they change the truth of God into a lie, while by considering these works themselves as deities and by worshipping them as such, they serve the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Now, notice this. Granted, some of this is specific to the pagan worldview. So the fact that they are worshipping the creature, like the created gods, rather than the creator, or probably might actually just be referring to matter in general. But in any case, yes, there is an idea. There is some specific polemic to the pagan gods, which is not relevant to iconodulia directly. However, notice this. Augustine, right after acknowledging the pagan distinction between that they're not worshipping the idol itself, but the god behind it, Augustine still says that the pagans consider the works as deities and worship them as such. The only way this makes sense is if we interpret Augustine as thinking that even directing acts of worship and supplication and honor towards an image, even in only a mediatorial sense, in Augustine's worldview, that's still treating the image as the thing itself. He doesn't have a middle way from mediatorial use of images like that. That's critical. That's a clincher right there. And also good to note how he actually distinguishes the two different things that Paul condemns. He says in the latter part, and this actually was a bit that was, I think it was actually quoted by either Horn or Albrecht, I think Horn, but he only quoted this second bit. In the latter part, like the latter part of Paul's statement, the account they give for idols because they're worshipping false gods, but he neglected the first part. In the former part of the sentence, he condemned idols. And the Latin term there is simulacrum, a likeness, a visage, a reflection of something. There's no necessary connotation in that word that something is only a simulacrum if it's possessed by a god. It's simply in reference to just a likeness made on behalf of a god. That's all it's in reference to. Augustine doesn't consider the idea here in this part that the pagans believe that the gods possess the idols. He does mention that in a brief way, talking about how the deities preside over the government of them, but he's not actually addressing that bit. That's the important thing. So he says that Augustine believes that when Paul says, who have changed the truth of God into a lie, he says that this is a condemnation of idols. And when we look at Augustine's statement here, it's even in the use of idols as a mediation, as a mediatorial instrument of honor, that this is exchanging the truth of God for a lie. Now, this is still in the context of this is still in a pagan context, even though it's not just applicable to that. But where this Augustine reference really shines is when he applies it to a Christian context right in the next section. He says the following: "But it will be said, we have very many instruments and vessels made of materials or metal of this description for the purpose of celebrating the sacraments." This is something that Trent Horn tried to emphasize as significant, which is not, but okay. "Which being consecrated by these ministrations are called holy, in honor of him who is thus worshipped for our salvation. And what indeed are these very instruments or vessels but the works of men's hands?" First thing to notice here, first thing you should actually catch here if you pay attention, he's giving an anticipated objection from the pagans. Hey, you're condemning us for having these idols because they're made of men's hands, but you guys have these things that are made of men's hands. What's gives? And you guys use them. Why would Augustine fail to mention icons, which are a infinitely closer analogy to pagan idols, much more obvious? Why would he not think that the pagans would point out Christian icons before pointing out Christian utensils, like liturgical utensils? I think this is actually a very, very significant silence that demonstrates that at least Augustine was unaware of even the presence of images at all, at least where he was. Key emphasis on at least where he was, because there's other places. But that's actually a very relevant issue. So he only anticipates the pagans complaining about liturgical utensils, which iconodules are very active to point out. Sometimes have images on them because that was a complaint from Tertullian. But yeah, that's just something significant. But in either case, what are these instruments but the works of men's hands? And here's how Augustine replies to that. "But have they mouth and yet speak not? Have they eyes and see not? Do we pray unto them because through them we pray to God? This is the chief cause of this insanity, that the figure resembling the living person which induces men to worship it hath more influence in the mind of these miserable persons than the evident fact that it is not living, so that it ought to be despised by the living." Let us look at Augustine's argument. We do not pray through our liturgical instruments, through images, if you will, because they had images on them if we're to listen to the iconodules. We do not pray through them to God. We do not pass honor through them to the prototype because of the evident fact that it's not living. So Augustine's rationale, once again, it even denies a mediatorial use of images where the image is not conflated. The liturgical utensil, if you will, used as an object through which prayer and honor can pass. He doesn't care that it's only used as a mediatorial sense because he thinks even for that purpose, it's unfit because it's dead. That is huge. That is significant. The only out I can see with this, well, there's really no out. That's a key iconodulic practice. When one goes into prayer, praying before an icon, physically you're directing that to the icon, and obviously you don't think it's praying to the icon directly, but it's going through the icon to God. And here's Augustine denying that very practice, at least with liturgical utensils. And how could that not apply to more literal images, which is the very stuff he was condemning earlier? Now, the only other out I can say to save face, I mean, he already flatly contradicts it, would be to say that Augustine, sure, he may be saying we can't pray through the image, but he doesn't mean we can't do other acts of veneration like kissing and bowing and all that, to which I'd say, just think about that for a second. Does that make a lick of sense if someone was to make that argument? I'm not saying anyone is, but would that make a lick of sense? Oh, you can't pray through the image or through the utensil because it's to God because it's dead. Oh, but you can bow before it and you can kiss it and mediatorily pass the honor through that way. Does that make any sense at all? No, I'm proud. I'll very much admit this is much more of an intuitive thing. That doesn't make sense at all, because the rationale is deeper. He's not saying that this is only and specifically with reference to prayer. His reasoning is that it's a non-living thing, and he's contrasting that with praying to a living thing, which makes sense because prayer, much more broadly conceived, is the only way it is conceived of is that it's done from living person to living person. Likewise with the acts of, normatively speaking, of bowing and kissing, because just as iconodules believe that when they pray to an image, they're only praying through an image to God. Likewise, when you bow to an image, you're bowing and kissing through the image to God. And so the very same logic and rationale does apply. The fact that it's not living, this act that you do towards a living being, that you do towards a living God, don't do that even mediatorily to a dead thing. And so it only makes sense that this would also apply to other iconodulic practices, but I don't even need to go there because this is already iconodulia here, praying through images. Augustine directly condemns that. Well, and not even just condemn that, he just says that we don't do it. He just says that we Christians don't do it at all, which is quite great. But yeah, again, summary, Augustine's argument, even as a mediator in a material sense of an image, of type, of honor going through the image to God, of prayer going through the image, through the object to God, it does not work because that thing is not living. And even though, again, proper hermeneutics, as we were just discussing earlier, even though he's specifically talking about liturgical utensils and not icons proper, the same thing applies. Because just like liturgical utensils, icons are not alive. They're not. And any iconodule who says otherwise would be destroying their whole rationale that it was a pagan thing that idols were alive.